You're listening to the Doctor Is In podcast. This is the show where you get the best tips, tricks, and nutritional hacks to help you and your family get healthier. You'll also hear what works and what doesn't work so you don't have to waste your time and money. All right, let's get started.
Hello, I'm Dr. Martin Jr.
And I'm Dr. Martin Sr.
And this is the Doctor Is In podcast, and this is episode 107. Now, a couple episodes ago, back on podcast episode 105, we talked all about your thyroid. And today what we want to do is talk all about your adrenal glands. And obviously the reason we're doing that is because they are extremely connected. They are usually go hand in hand when we talk about the metabolic storm. And again, if you want to learn more about the metabolic storm, we'll talk a little bit about it today as well, because it's definitely fitting for for the adrenal glands. But we do talk a fair amount about it back on episode 105. So let's talk today about the adrenal glands and why your symptoms are most likely due to an adrenal problem. First of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about the function of the adrenals?
Well, the adrenals, first of all, are found adrenal on top of kidneys. They're little chestnut-shaped organs. Their main function is to release cortisol, which is your stress hormone. So when you think of adrenals, think of stress hormones. They do more than that, but they're a big part of your fight and flight mechanism. You need them, and they better have a part-time job. Now, I want to tell you, first of all, the first time I ever put the adrenals into a condition was years and years ago when I wrote my first book on chronic fatigue syndrome. And it was interesting then that there was sort of an epidemic of chronic fatigue in the late 80s, and they called it the yuppie flu and the Epstein-Barr, and they had all these names for all these, mostly women becoming, sick without disease type of thing, right? They could never really find any specific changes in the brain or whatever, but they were exhausted. They didn't feel good. Women that were just type A personalities, give it to a woman, she'd get it done, and all of a sudden, they literally were exhausted. They had trouble getting out of bed. They couldn't sleep. And I sort of, I think I might have been the first. If I wasn't the first, I was close to it.
Yeah, there definitely was not a lot of people talking about the adrenals back when you wrote that book. Mm-hmm. And I remember you talking about the adrenals, and a lot of people not quite sure, what you were talking about.
Well, the thing is, too, with the adrenals, just remember, most physicians never even think of the adrenal gland.
And to be honest with you, we hear this all the time, is that a lot of physicians completely dismiss any type of issue with the adrenals altogether.
Yeah.
They think it's a made-up condition. But they also think the same thing about leaky gut, even though there's an abundance of research on that topic itself. But whenever you start talking about adrenal fatigue or, adrenal exhaustion, there's a lot of different words for it. People... You always get that one. It doesn't exist. It's made up. It's fake.
Fake news.
Yeah, fake news, right? And the reality is, how many people do you see every day that have some kind of adrenal stress or fatigue? And as you mentioned, there's a lot of other things that the adrenal glands do. But for the purpose of this episode, we'll kind of focus in a little bit about around cortisol. And before we start talking about some of the symptoms, and I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the ways that this presents in a real-life situation, I just want to quickly point out a couple of things about cortisol. Let's just talk a little bit about what cortisol does, just so people can get a better understanding on why, when it's not working, it's a big problem. One of the things that most people are surprised to learn about cortisol is its primary purpose is to raise your blood sugar levels.
Mm-hmm. To get you ready, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. As you mentioned, It's your fight or flight, right? In order to fight or flight, to run away, you need energy. And in order to get that energy, you have to have glucose present. So your body will secrete, or your adrenals will secrete the cortisol, and then cortisol will bring up your blood sugar levels. And it gives you this energy so that you could take off or you can fight. The problem is there are a lot of things today that stimulate the release of cortisol that have nothing to do with fighting or flighting, right? We live in a stressed world. People are stressed. And the funny thing is when we say the word stress, it doesn't always mean like emotional stuff. It doesn't always mean pressure at work.
It could be.
It could be, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, people are definitely more stressed at work. They're more stressed at home. But the body also interprets stress a lot of different ways. Too much exercise, not enough exercise, high levels of sugar, processed foods, bad oils, the pollution. You know, we live in a toxic world, the chemicals. So our body is constantly under the impression that it's under stress. So people
leaky gut.
That's right. And in fact, when we do a leaky gut episode coming up, we'll talk about how cortisol plays a big role in for some people in the start of leaky gut. But so that's the problem. We live in a world where people have always elevated levels of cortisol, and as a result, they always have a slightly issue going on with their blood sugar, or they got high insulin because the insulin's trying to lower the blood sugar. So that's the first thing I want you to kind of take away from this is that cortisol's main job is to raise your blood sugar levels. And then the second thing I find interesting is that cortisol is kind of secreted on what they call a cyclical basis. In theory, our cortisol levels are highest in the morning. Yeah, it makes sense, right? As you're getting ready in the morning, as your body's getting ready to get going, cortisol starts to secrete, gives you some energy, wakes you up, all those kind of things. Then it's supposed to taper down by the end of the day, and it's supposed to be lowest in the evening so that you can fall asleep.
Yeah.
So you can already start to think of the possible issues that can happen when cortisol levels are elevated, right? So those are the two things kind of, if nothing else, just kind of remember that cortisol will raise your blood sugar levels, and it should be highest in the morning and then kind of tapers off as the day goes on. And as we talk about the symptoms, you'll kind of see why that matters. So let's go through the symptoms, and then you have an interesting take on the difference between how a man presents with adrenal issues compared to how a female shows up with with issues. So maybe we'll start. Let's talk about that first, and then we'll go through the symptoms.
Okay. Well, and this is just real good clinical experience over lots of years and lots of testing. When men have high levels of cortisol for a long period of time, so stress, either like we talked about, external stress, and even internal stress doesn't affect a man, environmental or whatever, doesn't affect a man like it does a woman. So generally, I find that when you have high stress levels in a man over a long period of time, it has a tendency to affect him cardiovascular-wise. Which is very dangerous, obviously, right? Like when you think of, what causes heart disease and, men that drop over at 50 years old and have a massive heart attack and whatever, you know what? If you sit down and talk with doctors, they will be the first to admit when they do their all the blood work and whatever, well, he didn't have high cholesterol, like his cholesterol was normal, but he had high inflammation. He had lots of, his triglycerides were high. And there was a lot of factors like that, right? What they didn't look at is how much cortisol they had.
Well, and again, because cortisol, the primary purpose is to raise that blood sugar. And, we've said this so many times, but blood glucose is so toxic that it's so tightly regulated.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, because cortisol is raising blood sugar levels, then you have this man who is constantly secreting insulin to basically do something with that glucose it's in the blood. And as we've said so many times, heart disease is a symptom of high circulating insulin.
Yeah, it's high circulating insulin syndrome. Absolutely.
So if somebody has high cortisol levels for a long time, they always have high levels of insulin, which for a man will generally bring them down the path of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and anything else you see?
Well, I mean, that's generally what it is, right? So they're either pre-diabetic. It's very, very dangerous for a heart attack and stroke in a man, okay? So that's a man. Like, generally, this is what happens to them physiologically because the makeup is different. We don't have, I always say, in a woman, there's a lot of more moving parts because, and, we talk about it in the metabolic storm. Women are so much different because of ovaries and because of their thyroid. And the adrenals they're involved with that, right? So you can put a man and a woman, they're eating the same thing and they're doing the same thing. They might even have the same amount of stress, but the stress affects the woman much differently, in a much different way because of women, their hormone makeup in that, that pyramid I often talk about. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have the foundation of the ovaries. And then at the top, of course, you have the thyroid, and all those are connected. And the adrenals I always put them on a chart. They're sort of halfway up. And those things cause enormous amount of hormonal imbalance in a woman, not so much the disease, but imbalance.
How does a cortisol issue typically show up in a female?
Okay, so let me give you an example, even this morning, of a patient that came in to the office, and it was a typical patient that, because it doesn't take long. Once we do all their testing, we got them figured out, but the history is beautiful. Here's a woman that comes in, I think she was probably 35 years old, and the question I asked her, like I ask all my patients, the first question I ask them, okay, I'm 10 out of 10 energy. What are you, right? And she's telling me, well, I'm about a 4. At the best days, I'd be 4 out of 10. Now, come on, that's 35 years old. They're exhausted. They're drained, right? What other symptoms are they presenting with, right? Fatigue, brain fog, belly fat, trouble losing weight, insomnia, huge symptom.
Yeah,
they can't sleep, right? They're exhausted,
and that
but
makes
they can't
so much
sleep.
sense again because if cortisol is supposed to be low so you can fall asleep, when cortisol is elevated at nighttime, good luck.
Yeah.
I mean, really, good luck trying to sleep when your cortisol levels are elevated like they would be in the morning.
Yeah. So then, of course, the insomnia. And sometimes with the insomnia, what it is they're exhausted so they can get to sleep, but they can't stay asleep, right? Sometimes it's both. They can't even get to sleep. But a lot of them get to sleep for an hour or two, and then they're up. Boing, they wake up, and their energy levels, they're wide awake, and they know they need to sleep, and yet they have no ability to sleep. So insomnia is a big issue. This lady had acne. She had hair loss. She had cravings, major cravings for salt, even more salt than sugar, but more salt. She just, could live on a bag of chips. When I got into her history, frequent colds, especially last winter, she went through, one cold after time, she said, I think I had 10 colds in a row.
Yeah, generally they have not the strongest immune system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in her case, frequent bouts of nausea, often with diarrhea. And again, as you said, as how the cortisol affects the gut. And, it diverts blood to away from the gut, because it's getting ready for the flight or fight. So all these presenting symptoms were here. Well, it didn't take long. Once we looked at her cortisol levels, we saw, right? Here it is. And that's the major component, right? But she had all these symptoms of typical cortisol issues. And then I started getting into a little bit of history. Well, how long has it been since you haven't felt well? And, we took care of her father. He died a year ago. Her grandparents, I think her grandfather had died within a year and a half of the visit to the office. And I think one of their children was sick. And there was a lot of stress in the home because of that, and even a move, I think, and a change in jobs. So all those things make for a pattern of a typical patient that we would see with what I call adrenal gland exhaustion. So there's a real classic case that we've seen thousands and thousands of the times over the years.
Let's just maybe talk about some of the other symptoms. You painted a really good picture of what a typical, high cortisol or adrenal exhaustion looks like. And maybe we'll talk about some of the other symptoms in general that people may have and try to explain a little bit of why they get those symptoms. I think would be beneficial for people. Obviously, a big one is the inability to sleep.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to do with your circadian rhythm. It has to do with elevated cortisol. So not only can they not fall asleep, if they do, they typically wake up.
Yeah.
They
never get into that deep REM sleep, the recuperative sleep that they need. And it's a big, big factor. It really is when you look at of how the body breaks down. If you don't get a good sleep, you can think of that vicious cycle of, you're tired, but you're not sleeping. And, it can mess up the other hormones, your thyroid. And
if you're not sleeping, you're not healthy.
Yeah.
I mean, you may be healthy for a short period of time, but at the end of the day, I mean, your sleep is...
Very few people get away with any
you're not,
disruption in their sleep.
Your body is not meant to function.
And by the way, just as something that, because I get a lot of patients, and I understand them, I really do, and I'm very sympathetic, but they go on sleeping pills. What they don't realize is they're not sleeping with a sleeping pill. They're sedated.
There's a massive difference between sleep and sedation.
Yeah, yeah.
The body does not go through the same, which is why, way back when we did a podcast episode on some of those medications leading to Alzheimer's and brain, because what research is showing is that if you're not going through all those stages of sleep, and especially REM, REM sleep, your brain is not dumping. It's not. It's almost like the REM is like a cleanse, and it's where you store your memories. It's like a cleanse for your brain, and if you're not going through that, then it just leads to future dementia, Alzheimer issues. If you have to take a sleeping pill on a regular basis, first of all, it's going to cause some issues and some serious issues down the road. But you have to get to the root of the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And for a lot of times, it has to do with cortisol. Another big one as well, and this is something that you hear about a lot in the clinic, and a lot of times we get these emails, is heart palpitations, and especially at nighttime.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Their body is at fight or flight. It's just pounding, right? They lie down at nighttime. They can feel their heart beating.
And, I was sort of using an illustration the other day when I was in the Sioux, just giving that seminar of cortisol. I said, put your arms together, like just bring them together and squeeze, right, as much as you can, right into, like, clench your fists for 5 minutes, as hard as you can. Think about how you feel, right? Like, that will drain the living. Like, not only I think again, and I don't know if you were going to bring this up, but I'm going to talk about the symptoms of fibromyalgia, because the Martin Clinic was the first people, and I know this because of the book we published back in the early 90s. We were the first people that linked the adrenal glands to fibromyalgia. And fibromyalgia, when you think of it, right, is a severe pain characterized by after an accident, after a traumatic event, you start getting pain, and you can't get rid of it. It's just like medication hardly touches it, and fibromyalgia but it's a symptom. It's a symptom of the adrenal glands. I always tell people, look, fibro is because when you secrete cortisol all the time.
Has there been a more maligned group of people? Those with fibro are CFS, chronic fatigue. I mean, people just don't believe them.
No.
Right? They think they're lazy, depressed. People don't believe them.
Yeah.
And they suffer a lot. We read it, we hear it, we see it. And, our heart goes out to them because we just know that a lot of people in their support system just doesn't necessarily believe them.
Yeah.
And, so it's very unfortunate. But anyways, that's just a little aside. Another issue that is very, very common when it comes to elevated or chronically elevated is a really bad digestive system.
Mm-hmm.
And makes sense, right? I mean, you go through, two stages in a sense. You have that fight or flight, or you have that rest and digest, right? You're supposed to spend a lot of time in the day in that rest and digest. You're supposed to be able to digest your food after eating. Well, you can imagine if you got elevated cortisol all the time and those bowels are not digesting properly, it not only does it create inflammation, it just absolutely destroys the good bacteria. Eventually, it leads to leaky gut, which then could lead to diverticulitis.
Well, think of it, too, when you're stressed, okay? Let's say you have an event coming, okay? So ladies would... you got a wedding coming tomorrow. Your daughter's getting married or whatever. Think of, what, you got butterflies in the stomach, right? You got my stomach. Well, think of how the connection, then it's easy to understand the connection between cortisol, right, and the gut. You can see, I get butterfly. What am I? I got to speak tomorrow, or I got a big event tomorrow, and I'm all nervous about it. Well, where does that nervousness hit you? It hits you in your stomach. So people go, what is that? That's cortisol. That's cortisol. That's there's not a better example of how your nervous system works, right? I mean, it works on that basis.
Yeah, and. In a few episodes, we're going to be doing a real good detailed talk on leaky gut and how far-reaching it is. So I'm looking forward to that episode. Let's just talk about a couple more here as we're running out of time. Another one that you see a lot of times, people that have chronically elevated cortisol is kind of that mid-afternoon slump.
Yeah. Right?
They just, 3 o'clock comes around and they're just like dragging.
Yeah. And again, the physiology behind it. Think about it. We wrote a book, right? Serial Killers, 2 Hormones That Want You Dead, right? And when, like you say, what does cortisol do? It elevates your blood sugar, right? So mid-afternoon, what are you doing? Your blood sugar is synced like the Titanic. You ate lunch, and, an hour or two after, your blood sugar is coming down. And again, it's those connections between your insulin and your blood sugars and your cortisol, right?
All right, a couple more just quickly here. The inability to handle stress, they're more anxious. I mean, it makes
now
sense.
You got anxiety.
Yeah, that's right. And that's
you never had anxiety. Well, this lady, I didn't even mention that, but I'm glad you brought it up. This patient had anxiety. Never had anxiety. Doc, I never been anxious before. Now I got anxiety. And of course, you know what? Anxiety is overtaken. You can get, even with cortisol, you can get I always put anxiety/depression, because a lot of people will fluctuate from anxiety to depression or vice versa. But this lady was saying, I've never had any anxiety, and I was telling her this morning, I said, you know what? Anxiety has overtaken depression in our society today. And the amount of medications that are given, right, for anxiety and depression have skyrocketed.
Yeah, and it's, it's really a shame, because it's almost as if a lot of times what happens is that you can just picture the doctor's not quite sure how to handle the symptoms that are going on, and it's an easy thing to do, right? You reach for your pad, you write a prescription, and then, without getting to the root cause of what's going on. All right, so we're almost out of time. Well, we are out of time, but a lot of times, let's just quickly talk about the overlap. And this is what we, really specialize in our clinic, is that overlap. Because rarely do you see somebody that has chronically elevated cortisol, who has some kind of an adrenal issue going on, that doesn't have thyroid. So they're going to have a lot of adrenal symptoms, but they're also going to have a lot of thyroid symptoms, right? That's when they start getting cold hands, cold feet. Their hair starts to thin. Their metabolism slows down. And they also get a lot of ovary symptoms, right? A lot of estrogen dominant symptoms.
Yeah.
So then all of a sudden they have a hard time with fertility. They have
acne,
headaches, all those things. There's a real crossover that's taking place.
Yeah.
And a lot of the error that we see people attempting to fix their problems is that they don't take into effect or into account the big picture, what's really going on. And that's where we talk about that metabolic storm. You know, you got that perfect storm of adrenals, thyroid, and ovaries that are kind of creating this, you know, just an absolute plethora of symptoms.
Yeah. The Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah.
You fall into that, right? You get all these crazy symptoms. And, you know, the thing, too, is really important, and I have to mention it on the podcast. The cortisol formula, is essential. I just find that there's nothing like it.
Yeah, what we've done for that is we've basically handpicked and gone out and formulated a product that we use in our clinic that really addresses all the different aspects of elevated cortisol, right? I mean, it's almost like a multivitamin whose purpose is to help, fix the adrenals, lower cortisol, and, people love it. I mean, it's just patients absolutely very, very love it. And again, if you're listening, if you're going through these symptoms, if you're listening and you're saying, man, that's exactly what I'm going through, I would encourage you to, go to our website, listen to some other podcasts. If you're not getting our newsletter, sign up. We talk a lot about this. We talk a lot about solutions. We present a lot of information. And also we have a program specifically called, Fix Your Metabolic Storm. And it's basically the exact system that you use in our clinic to fix this, get rid of it. It's helped many, many, many women, thousands over the years from all over the world. So, again, we really want to thank you for listening to this episode. If you have any questions or any suggestions for future topics that you want us to cover, you can email us at info@martinclinic.com. As I mentioned, if you're not a newsletter subscriber, you're missing out. Man, we just send out so much information every week. You can listen to our podcasts, you can read our newsletters, and never buy anything from us and get healthier. And that's our goal, right? I mean, that's what we want. We want to provide as much information as possible. So again, we want to thank you for listening, and be sure to tune in again next week.